The morning Clara Kingsley walked into the Dusty Creek savings and loan with nothing but a ledger full of debts and a prayer stitched together with sheer desperation. She had no way of knowing that the dusty, sun-bronzed cowboy leaning against the hitching post outside would become the reason she learned to breathe again. Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, was not a town that offered much in the way of mercy. It sat squat and sun-baked along the edge of the Llano Estacado, where the flat earth stretched out in every direction like God had ironed the land smooth and forgotten to put anything interesting on it. The town had a general store run by a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Aldridge, a saloon that smelled of sawdust and poor decisions, a church whose roof leaked every time it rained, and a savings and loan office presided over by one Harold Birch, a man who wore his greed the way other men wore their Sunday best, proudly and without apology. Clara was 24 years old, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of cheekbones that would have made an artist weep and the kind of stubbornness that made bankers nervous. She had been running her father's farm alone for nearly 8 months, ever since Thomas Kingsley had succumbed to a fever that no amount of willow bark tea or doctoring could break. Her father had left her the land, 60 acres of good soil along Cottonwood Creek, along with a mule named Jasper, 3 dairy cows, a vegetable garden that had mostly gone to weeds, and a debt of $230 owed to Harold Birch. She had tried every honest thing she knew to raise that money. She had sold eggs and butter at the Saturday market. She had taken in mending for the ranchers' wives. She had even offered to teach reading lessons to the children of the Mexican families who lived in the settlement south of town, though they could barely afford to pay her in dried corn and gratitude. The debt had been whittled down to $140, which was still a sum so enormous it might as well have been a mountain range standing between her and the life she needed to hold on to. Harold Birch had given her until the 1st of June to pay the full remainder, and it was now the 15th of May. She had $43.70 in a tin box under her kitchen floorboard. So she walked into the savings and loan that Tuesday morning with her back straight and her hat held in both hands, because she had decided that if she was going to beg, she would at least do it with dignity. She did not notice Aaron Sawyer right away, because he was seated in the back of the outer room on a wooden bench, turning the brim of his own hat around in his hands in a slow, patient circle. He was tall even seated, with the lean and rangy build of a man who spent more time on horseback than off it. He wore a faded blue shirt, dark canvas trousers worn pale at the knees, and boots that had seen a few hundred miles of hard country. There was a week's worth of stubble on his jaw and honest tiredness around his gray eyes, and he looked at her with the passing, polite attention of a man who noticed people without making them feel watched. Clara gave him a brief nod and turned to the clerk at the desk, a young fellow named Timothy who always looked slightly apologetic for being alive. "I need to speak with Mr. Birch," she said. "He's occupied, Miss Kingsley," Timothy said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'll wait." She sat on the bench opposite Aaron Sawyer. The room was small and smelled of paper and ink and something slightly musty, like ambition left out in the rain. A clock on the wall ticked with the officious regularity of a metronome nobody had asked for. "You here to argue with Birch too?" the man on the bench said. Clara looked at him. His voice was low and unhurried, with the particular cadence of a man from further west, maybe New Mexico territory or Arizona. "I am here to negotiate," she said carefully. The corner of his mouth did something that was almost a smile. "That's a fancier word for it. What word would you use?" "Argue," he said simply, and this time the smile arrived fully, brief and warm as a candle in a drafty room. "I'm Clara Kingsley," she said, because something in that small, honest smile made her feel like introducing herself was a reasonable thing to do. "Aaron Sawyer," he said, and touched the brim of his hat even though he was holding it in his hands, which produced a small, awkward motion that was somehow endearing. "I run cattle for the Harmon spread about 12 miles east of here. Or I did, until Harmon sold up and moved to San Antonio last month without paying me the last 3 months of wages he owed me." "That's a terrible thing," Clara said. "It is," Aaron agreed without particular dramatics. "I'm here because Harmon kept his operating account at this bank, and I'm hoping Birch will let me attach some of what's owed to me before it all disappears into Harmon's pocket down in San Antonio." "Will he?" Aaron looked at the door to Birch's inner office with the expression of a man who had already assessed his odds and found them uninspiring. "Probably not. Men like Birch tend to look out for men like Harmon. That's how it works." Clara felt the familiar weight of that particular truth settle in her chest. She knew exactly how it worked. She had been learning it for 8 months. The door to Harold Birch's office opened, and a red-faced rancher named Douglas Webb came out looking like he had swallowed something unpleasant, but had decided to keep it down out of pure pride. He brushed past both of them without acknowledgement and pushed out through the front door hard enough to set the little bell above it jangling. "Mr. Sawyer," Timothy said nervously, "Mr. Birch will see you now." Aaron stood, settled his hat on his head, and looked at Clara for one moment before he walked to the door. "Good luck with your negotiating, Miss Kingsley," he said. "And with your arguing," she replied. He was in there for 20 minutes. She could hear the voices through the thin wall, not the words, just the shape of the conversation. Aaron's voice steady and measured, Birch's oily and incrementally louder. When Aaron came out, his jaw was set and there was a quiet anger in his eyes that he was controlling with visible effort. He stopped in front of her. "He says he can't release funds already processed through a closed account without a court order, which would take 2 months and cost more in lawyers' fees than the wages are worth." "I'm sorry," Clara said, and meant it. He shrugged, and there was something in the shrug that was not defeat exactly, but a kind of recalibration. A man figuring out which direction was forward now that the road he had been on had ended. "Miss Kingsley," Timothy said. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and walked into Harold Birch's office. Harold Birch was a soft man with hard eyes, which was the worst possible combination. He had small pink hands and a neat little mustache, and the habit of steepling his fingers when he wanted to appear thoughtful, which Clara had come to understand, was almost always when he was about to say something he had already decided before she entered the room. "Miss Kingsley," he said, steepling his fingers, "I trust you have good news." "I have $43, she said, setting the tin on his desk. "And I am asking for an extension of 60 days on the balance of the loan." He looked at the tin the way a person looks at a gift they find disappointing. "We have had this conversation before." "Then we are having it again," he sighed. "Miss Kingsley, the bank has been more than patient with your situation. Your father took out that loan on specific terms. Those terms expire on the 1st of June. The property will need to be assessed and the matter resolved by that date. I am sorry, but there is simply nothing I can do. You could extend the terms. The board would not approve it. You are the board, Mr. Birch. You and your brother-in-law own 51% of this institution." His eyes went a fraction colder. "I would encourage you not to make this situation adversarial, Miss Kingsley. It will not help you." She took her tin off his desk, because leaving it there felt like surrender, and she was not surrendering anything yet. "I will have the remainder of the money before June 1st, she said. Outside, the May sun hit her like a flat hand. She stood on the boardwalk and breathed for a moment, and then noticed that Aaron Sawyer was still there, unhitching his horse from the post. The horse was a striking animal, a dark bay with a wide chest and intelligent eyes, wearing a saddle that was clearly well cared for, tooled leather with a particular pattern of running water or maybe wind along the skirt, the kind of work that took real skill to produce. "How did it go?" he asked. "About as well as yours," she said. He nodded slowly, like that was the answer he had expected. He stood there for a moment with one hand on his horse's neck, and Clara could see him thinking, working something through. "How much do you need?" he said. She looked at him. "I beg your pardon. How much are you short to cover the loan payment?" Clara felt her chin lift slightly, the automatic reflex of a woman who had been pitied before and found it intolerable. "That is not your concern, Mr. Sawyer. "No, it isn't," he said agreeably, "but I am asking anyway." She studied him for a moment. He was not looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with the straightforward assessment of a man trying to solve a problem. There was something businesslike in it, and that was less unbearable. $97, she said, because the number had been sitting on her tongue all morning. I have 43 toward the 140. I need 97 more before June 1st. He was quiet for a moment. I have $112 in the bank in Abilene, he said, saved from the 2 years before Harmon stopped paying. I could lend you 100. Clara stared at him. The boardwalk creaked beneath the feet of someone walking past. A wagon went by on the street, raising a small cloud of dust. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you came in here with your back straight and your hat in your hands, and you were in there for 15 minutes and you came out still carrying your tin box, which means you didn't give up what you brought in hopes of getting something back," he said. "That tells me something. It tells you I failed to make a deal. It tells me you have principles," he corrected. "Now I will be honest with you, Miss Kingsley. I don't have work right now and I need to find some. I'm not lending you money to be a charity. I'm lending it because I need a reason to stay in one place long enough to find solid work, and this gives me a stake in something going right. If you manage your farm and can repay me over the next year, I come out whole and may be employed in the meantime. That's the transaction as I see it." Clara was quiet. Somewhere down the street a door slammed and a dog barked. "I have nothing to offer as security," she said slowly. "The land itself is already pledged against Birch's loan." He was quiet for a moment, and then he did something she did not expect. He reached up and unbuckled the saddle from his horse, lifting it down with the practiced ease of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and he set it on the hitching post in front of her. "Take this as collateral," he said. "Your saddle." She looked at it, at the careful tooling, at the worn but well-kept leather that spoke of years of use and years of care. "It's the most valuable thing I own," he said, and she could hear that this was simply true. "A working cowboy without a saddle is just a man on foot. If I'm putting up this, you know I'm serious about getting it back, and you know I'll need to be around to collect it." She looked at the saddle for a long moment. The tooling along the skirt depicted what she now realized were waves, not wind or water but actual ocean waves, which was an odd and somehow touching thing for a man from the dry interior to have had worked into his saddle. "Why waves?" she asked, and immediately felt it was a peculiar question given the moment. He glanced at the tooling. A small quiet passed. "My mother grew up in Massachusetts," he said. "She always talked about the ocean. Never got back to see it. She asked the leatherworker to put it on there when she had this made for me." He said it matter-of-factly, but there was something underneath the matter-of-fact that Clara recognized as the particular weight of a thing you carry without complaint. "Mr. Sawyer," she said carefully, "I will take your loan and I will repay it in full within the year with fair interest, but I cannot take your saddle." "Then consider it a deposit," he said. "On the chance that you might need my help around your farm while I am between positions. I know cattle and horses and I know how to fix fence. I'm not asking for wages until the farm is solvent. In the meantime, keep the saddle safe." She looked at him for a long moment. The street went on around them with its ordinary morning business, oblivious. "That is a peculiar arrangement," she said finally. "It is," he agreed. "All right," she said. She did not know, in that moment, that she had just agreed to the beginning of everything. The farm on Cottonwood Creek was not a beautiful place in any of the ways that word usually applied, but it had a quality that Clara had tried and failed to name, something in the way the late afternoon light came horizontal through the cottonwood trees along the creek bank and turned the ordinary fence posts and weathered barn walls into something almost golden. She had grown up here. Every weather-beaten board held a story she knew. That was not beauty exactly, but it was something more durable. Aaron Sawyer arrived the following Monday with his horse, his saddlebags, the clothes on his back, and nothing else, because of course he had no saddle, it being in Clara's front room draped over the wooden rack she had fashioned from 2 chair backs and a broom handle. He had ridden the 12 miles bareback, which told her something significant about both his horsemanship and his stubbornness. "You rode bareback from Dusty Creek," she said. "Belle doesn't mind," he said, which was not entirely true because Belle was an opinionated mare who minded quite a lot of things. But she had been patient about this particular indignity because Aaron had talked to her quietly the entire way. Clara had prepared the small room off the back of the house, the one her father had used as a washroom and tool storage. It had a narrow cot, a window that faced east, and just enough space for a man and his saddlebags. It was clean and honest, and Aaron looked at it with the expression of a man who had slept in considerably worse arrangements, which was true. "Meals are at 6 and noon," she said. "I rise at 5. The dairy cows need milking before breakfast. I'll show you the fence line that needs mending along the north pasture. The vegetable garden is going to need replanting if we're going to have anything to sell this fall." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "My name is Clara," she said, because she was 24 and had been running a farm alone for 8 months, and found the ma'am somewhat oppressive given that they were apparently going to be sharing bread and a property line. "Clara," he said, and nodded, and went to see to his horse. The first week was quietly extraordinary in the way that efficient cooperation between people who do not yet know each other well can be. They worked side by side without much conversation, which was not awkward but was instead the practical silence of two people focused on the same problems. The fence line was worse than Clara had described it, and better than Aaron had feared. They replaced 17 posts and restrung wire for nearly 200 yards, and by the end of the week the north pasture was actually secure, which it had not been for close to a year. He was good with the dairy cows in a way Clara had not expected, because dairy cattle and beef cattle were different enterprises, and most cattlemen from the open range had no patience with the one-at-a-time quietude of milking. But he sat with the cows patiently and spoke to them in the same low tone he used with Belle, and they gave their milk without complaint. "You have a way with animals," she observed on the fourth morning, setting the full pail on the fence post. "I grew up on a small operation in New Mexico," he said. "We had everything: beef cattle, milk cows, chickens, one hog nobody liked." He was quiet for a moment. "Sold it 6 years ago when my father died. The ranch, I mean, not the hog." She almost smiled at that. "What happened to the hog?" "Old age," he said solemnly. "He had a full life." She did smile then, and it surprised her slightly because she had not smiled at anything in a long time, not since before her father got sick. In the evenings, after supper, they would sometimes sit on the porch if the weather was mild, which it mostly was in late May, the air still warm from the day but cooling at the edges. They talked about practical things at first: the planting schedule, whether to try to get a second dairy cow, whether the vegetable garden could produce enough surplus for the Saturday market. But the practical things became a channel through which other things flowed, the way rivers carry more than water. She told him about her father on the 9th day, on a Wednesday evening when the sky went extraordinary colors over the flat land to the west, purples and burnt oranges that seemed too dramatic for such a plain landscape. "He taught me everything about this farm," she said. "He also thought I would have married by 20 and gone somewhere else," which was his way of saying he both wanted me to be happy and also could not quite imagine that I would stay. When I was still here at 22, he stopped saying that. I think he was secretly glad. "Were you glad?" Aaron asked. She thought about it honestly. "Yes and no. I liked the land. I didn't always like the solitude." He was quiet, looking at the sky. "Why did you stay at the Harmon spread so long?" she asked. 3 years is a long time to work for one outfit. Harmon had good land and a decent operation, he said, and I was good at the work, foreman position, which meant I had responsibility and a real wage. Or I was supposed to. He turned his hat in his hands. She had noticed he did this when he was thinking, the slow circular movement like a wheel turning thoughts over. "Truthfully, I stayed because I kept thinking I was building towards something, a stake large enough to start something of my own." He paused, and then it turned out I was building toward Harmon's retirement and a swindle. "What will you do now?" she asked. After, when the season changes. He looked at the sky for a long time. I don't know yet, he said. But she noticed that the question of going did not seem to sit heavily on him the way she might have expected, like a man impatient to be moving. He said it with the quality of a man who was, for the moment, content with where he was. June 1st arrived and Clara walked into the savings and loan with $143 in the tin box, which was the $3 over what she owed because she had decided that small excess felt like dignity. She paid the loan, took the stamped receipt from Timothy's trembling hands, and walked out into the June sun with the farm secure under her feet. She went back to Cottonwood Creek and found Aaron in the barn, doing something careful and deliberate with a section of leather harness and a curved needle. He looked up when she came in. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He nodded, and she saw something in his face relax that had been held tight for weeks, not for his own sake, she realized, but for hers. He had been carrying a quiet anxiety about this on her behalf, which was a thing nobody had done for her in a very long time. "Thank you," she said, and because simple words did not seem adequate, she added, "I mean that with everything I have." He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that she had noticed had the quality of still water, not blank but deep, things moving underneath the surface that were not immediately visible. "You did it," he said. "I just helped with the fence." She laughed, because that was such a profound understatement, and the laugh felt bright and real in the dusty June warmth. The summer that followed was one of those summers that burns itself into a person's memory, not because of any single extraordinary event, but because of the accumulated weight of many ordinary ones. Clara would remember it later as a summer of mornings, the particular quality of light at 5:30 when she and Aaron would begin the day's work, the way the dew was on the grass along the creek bank, the way the sky was that pure colorless clarity before the heat came up. The mornings when they worked side by side and found, without either of them saying so, that they had fallen into a rhythm as natural and unplanned as breathing. She noticed other things too. The way he held the door of the barn open for her when both hands were full, not with the performance of manners, but as natural reflex. The way he could go an entire morning without talking, and the silence was not uncomfortable but companionable. The way he laughed when something was actually funny, which was not often, but when it happened it transformed his face entirely, making the tiredness around his eyes disappear for a moment and turning him into someone younger and lighter. He had a small collection of books in his saddlebags, which she discovered in early July when she was mending one of the bags and its contents spilled. 3 books, a worn copy of The Virginian was not yet written, so what he had was a copy of Roughing It by Mark Twain, a slim volume of poems by Walt Whitman, and a dog-eared copy of David Copperfield by Dickens, the pages so worn that the spine had been reinforced with a strip of leather. "You carry Dickens on cattle drives," she said. He looked only mildly embarrassed. "Long nights in camp," he said. "You run out of card games." She borrowed the Dickens and they began in the evenings to read aloud from it in turns, because she had always loved reading and had nobody to read with. The porch became their reading room when the light lasted, and the kitchen table when it did not. She would read, and he would listen with his hands still for once, not turning his hat, just listening, and sometimes when she stopped at the end of a passage, he would say something insightful about the characters that surprised her with its depth. "You think clearly about people," she said one evening in late July. "I've had a lot of time to observe them," he said. "Cattle drives, you spend months with the same small group. You learn how people work under pressure. And how do people work under pressure? Mostly badly," he said, "but occasionally magnificently." She looked at him. "Which were you?" He considered this seriously. "Mostly badly at first," he said, "and then I learned to wait." "Wait for what?" "For the feeling to pass," he said. "Whatever the pressure is creating in you, the fear or the anger or the panic, if you wait it passes and then you can think." She thought about this for a long time afterward. She thought about it the next morning, while milking the cows and again in the afternoon, while she was thinning the carrot plants in the kitchen garden. It seemed to her that it was not just a description of how he handled cattle drives. It was a description of how he had handled the situation at the bank, the situation with Harmon, the situation of arriving at a stranger's farm with no work and no prospects. He had waited, and then he had thought, and then he had acted. She wondered what it would be like to be loved by a man who had that quality. The thought came to her unexpectedly, on a Thursday afternoon while she was watching him repair the garden fence where a section had pulled loose, and it startled her enough that she dropped the bundle of carrot thinnings she was holding and had to collect them again from the dirt. She was not a woman who had spent much time in romantic contemplation. There had been a young man when she was 19, the son of a neighboring farmer, who had courted her with the determined incompetence of someone following a manual nobody had given him. That had come to nothing when his family moved east. Since then, the business of keeping the farm alive had been so consuming that softer thoughts had simply not found space. But here was Aaron Sawyer in her garden fence, his shirt sleeves pushed up to the elbows in the July heat, working with focused patience, and the thought had come nonetheless and was now sitting very present in her chest. She told no one, including herself, for a considerable time. In August the creek rose unexpectedly after a week of heavy rain to the north, which was a weather pattern the Llano Estacado was capable of serving up with little warning. The Cottonwood Creek ran over its banks by nearly 2 feet and flooded the low corner of the south pasture, which was where Clara kept her best dairy cow, a large placid brown animal named Sunday, along with the other two. Aaron went into the flooded pasture in knee-deep water to move the cows to higher ground, which was necessary and also somewhat absurd to watch, because Sunday was not a cow who saw the urgency in any situation and had to be physically persuaded to move through the floodwater toward the barn. Aaron spent 40 minutes in the water, talking to Sunday with extraordinary patience while the rain continued, and Clara held the barn door open and watched with a mixture of anxiety and something she was beginning to recognize as affection. By the time he got all 3 cows to the barn, he was soaked through and covered in mud to the hip, and Sunday was expressing her opinion of the whole affair through a series of low, disapproving sounds. She did not want to move, Aaron said. Sunday never wants to move, Clara said. That is her defining characteristic. She heated water on the stove and brought him dry clothes from the bundle her father had left, which were too short in the leg but close enough, and he changed and came to the kitchen where she had made coffee, and there was warmth from the stove and the rain against the windows. They sat across the kitchen table from each other, and he wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, and she looked at his hands, which were good hands, calloused and capable, and she thought about how those hands had spent 40 minutes in a flooded pasture arguing with her cow. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Of course I did," he said, as though she had said something faintly nonsensical. "You could have let the water come up and see if she moved herself." Sunday. He glanced at the window in the direction of the barn. No, she would have stood there until it was up to her ears and complained the whole time. Clara laughed, and he looked at her when she laughed, and for a moment something passed between them that was not quite what their arrangement was, and both of them were aware of it, and both of them, in their own ways, were not quite ready for it. But it was there. In September, Clara rode into Dusty Creek for the Saturday market and sold enough butter and eggs and early squash to put another $20 toward Aaron's repayment. She came home to find him sitting on the porch with what appeared to be a piece of paper and a pencil, doing arithmetic. "I have been thinking about the cattle question," he said without preamble. "What cattle question?" "You have 60 acres and currently you have 3 dairy cows on it. Your income is marginal and depends on the market price of butter, which fluctuates." "I am aware," she said dryly. "There's a man in Abilene named Peterson who is selling off his small beef herd, 8 head of good breeding stock, because he is moving his family to Kansas. I heard about it last week from the man who delivers feed. The price would be reasonable." He turned the paper so she could see it. He had drawn a rough map of the farm with the pastures marked and written numbers at each section: estimated grazing capacity, estimated feed cost, estimated return over 2 years from breeding sales. If you added 8 head of beef cattle to this property, within 2 breeding seasons you would have a herd of roughly 15 to 20 depending on outcomes. That would give you a second income stream independent of the dairy market. Clara looked at the paper for a long time. Then she looked at him. "When did you do this?" she said. "Over the last few evenings," he said, with the mild defensiveness of a man who is not sure if his helpfulness is welcome. "This is," she began, and did not know how to finish it, because it was not just practical, it was care. It was someone looking at her situation and thinking about how to make it better, not for any immediate personal gain, but just because it needed to be better. "This is very thorough," she finished. "I know cattle," he said simply. "Would you go to Abilene with me?" she asked. "To look at the herd?" Something shifted in his expression. "You don't need me to. I know I don't need you to," she said firmly. "I am asking if you will." A pause. "Yes," he said. "Of course." They rode to Abilene over 2 days in late September, which meant the first night was spent at a stage coach in Midway between Dusty Creek and Abilene. Clara had stayed at inns before and was not particularly concerned about what people might think of a woman traveling with a man who was not her husband or brother, because the West in 1882 was practical about these arrangements in a way that the drawing rooms of the East were not, and she had long since decided that managing other people's opinions was a luxury she could not afford. The inn was run by an older woman named Mrs. Proctor, who had the watchful competence of someone who had managed difficult situations for decades, and Clara liked her immediately. There were 4 other travelers in the common room for supper: a drummer with a sample case, 2 brothers who looked like minor outlaws but who turned out to be moving their family's furniture, and a Presbyterian minister who was visiting his sister's congregation further west. They ate supper at the common table, and the conversation was easy and wide-ranging, the way conversations at inn tables can be when people are briefly and casually thrown together. Aaron was quiet but participated when addressed, and Clara noticed that the minister seemed to take it for granted that they were married, which produced a small internal disturbance in her that she filed under practical considerations and examined carefully only after she had said good night and shut the door of her own small room. They reached Abilene on the second day in the early afternoon, found Peterson at his farm outside of town, and spent 2 hours looking at his cattle. They were good animals, well-fed and well-tempered, and Aaron moved through the small herd with the assured authority of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at, checking teeth and hooves and general condition with quiet efficiency. Clara watched him and watched the cattle and reached her own conclusions, which matched his. Afterward, Peterson invited them in for coffee, and they sat in the man's kitchen with his wife Emma, who was visibly excited about the move to Kansas, and talked about her sister's family there, with the brightness of someone following a long-held hope. Clara listened to Emma Peterson talk about her sister and felt something move in her, something about family, about belonging, about the particular way a woman's face changes when she talks about the people she loves. She found herself looking at Aaron across the table, who was listening to Peterson talk about the cattle arrangements with polite attention, and she thought, he would listen to me talk like that. He would listen to me talk about anything I cared about, and he would actually be interested, and when I was finished, he would say something true. The purchase was agreed. They would return in 3 weeks with the payment, which Clara had from her fall market earnings, and a small additional sum from the repayment fund she had been building for Aaron's loan. Riding back toward the inn that evening, the sun going down ahead of them, the flat land turning amber and then deep rose, Aaron said quietly, "Emma Peterson seemed happy." "She did," Clara agreed. "She said it took them 4 years to decide to make the move. That they had almost gone, and then stayed twice before they finally went." "Sometimes it takes time to do the thing you know you want," Clara said, and was immediately somewhat alarmed by how true that felt and how applicable it seemed beyond the Petersons. Aaron was quiet for a while, and then he said, "What do you want, Clara? Not the farm, not the debt. What do you actually want?" She looked at the horizon for a long time. The first stars were appearing at the edge of the sky, very faint, just suggesting themselves. "I want the farm to be well," she said. "I want to not be afraid of losing it. I want—" She stopped, because the next thing she wanted to say felt very large and she was not certain the moment was right for it, and yet the moment had the quality of an opening that might not return. "I want not to be alone in it," she said. "Whatever it is, whatever comes." Aaron did not say anything for a moment, and then he said her name in a way that was different from how he usually said it. Not the everyday practical use of it, but something that had weight and intention behind it. "Clara," he said again, and stopped his horse, and she stopped hers, and they were side by side in the rose-colored evening, and he looked at her with those gray eyes that she had been reading like a book for 4 months, and she could see clearly what was there. "I should tell you something," he said. "I should have told you before now, probably. I find myself," and for the first time she saw him genuinely uncertain, the patient, competent man briefly unmoored by feeling, and it was the most endearing thing she had ever seen. "I don't want to leave Cottonwood Creek," he said. "I don't want to go find the next job and the next outfit and go on the way I was going. I want—" He stopped again, and she saw him do the thing he had described to her, waiting for the feeling to be manageable, and she waited too. "I want to ask if there is a possibility," he said carefully, "that what we have found in the last months could be something more than it has been." The sky was deep rose, and the stars were coming out, and the horses were standing still and patient in the way horses do when their riders have stopped for reasons that have nothing to do with them. "There is a very strong possibility," Clara said, and her voice was steady though her heart was doing something loud and complicated. "In fact, I would call it a near certainty." He looked at her for a moment, and then that rare full smile came across his face, and she thought, "There it is. That's the thing I have been waiting to see again since the first time it appeared in the savings and loan in May." He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand, and they sat there for a moment, hand in hand, in the last of the evening light, and Clara Kingsley felt something unknot in her chest that she had not known was knotted until it was free. The ride back to the inn that night was different from any other they had taken together. Not in anything that would have been visible to an outside observer, perhaps. They still rode side by side, spoke of ordinary things, arrived at the inn and went to their separate rooms in a manner that Mrs. Proctor's establishment and the presence of a Presbyterian minister entirely required. But inside each ordinary word there was now the knowledge of something named, and that changed everything. Over the following weeks, back at Cottonwood Creek, the something that had been named grew at its own deliberate pace. He was not a man for grand gestures, which she appreciated, because she was not a woman for them. What there was instead were 100 small things. A wildflower left on the porch step one morning that she recognized as the variety that grew specifically along the creek bank, which meant he had gone to the creek before breakfast to pick it. A fence repair on a section she had mentioned needing attention before she had found the time to address it. An evening when she was tired after a hard day, and he made supper without being asked, and it was not good cooking exactly, but it was warm and intended. And then there was the conversation. On an October evening when the air had turned cool and they had moved inside, sitting at the kitchen table with the oil lamp between them, he set down his coffee and looked at her with the expression of a man who had been building towards something. "Clara," he said, "I want to ask you something directly because I don't think either of us does well with things being left unsaid." "I think that's true," she agreed. "I want to stay," he said. "Not just through the season. I want to stay. I want to build something here with you if you'll have that. If you'll have me." He paused. "I am not a rich man. I have no land of my own. What I have is the loan I gave you and no saddle and about 6 years of experience with cattle and horses and whatever honest work needs doing. I know that is not much." She looked at the lamp between them and at him. "You left out the Dickens," she said. A small pause and then, I left out the Dickens, and the fact that you have an extraordinary patience with difficult dairy cows. Sunday likes me, he agreed. And that you spend your evenings thinking about how to make other people's problems better when you could very reasonably spend them thinking about your own. She folded her hands on the table. Aaron, you sat in that savings and loan in May with 3 months of unpaid wages and an unhelpable situation, and your first instinct was to help someone else. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a great deal. He was very still. Yes, she said, I will have that. He reached across the table and took her hand again, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there was nothing that needed saying, and the lamp burned steadily between them. And outside, the October wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek with a sound like rushing water. They were married in December of 1882 in the leaky-roofed church in Dusty Creek on a Saturday morning that was cold and bright and unreasonably beautiful. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Thomas Hadley, who had been preaching in Dusty Creek for 12 years, and who had seen enough of life to recognize when two people were serious about what they were promising. Clara wore her mother's wedding dress, which had been wrapped in brown paper in the chest at the foot of the bed, and which, with some alterations by Mrs. Aldridge from the general store, who turned out to have considerable skill with a needle, fit her almost perfectly. Aaron wore his cleanest shirt and a jacket borrowed from the man who ran the feed store, which was slightly too wide in the shoulders but was respectable, and he stood at the front of that church with an expression of such calm and settled certainty that Clara, walking toward him down the aisle with Reverend Hadley's wife holding a small spray of dried wildflowers at the door, felt no anxiety at all. Just a clarity so sharp and clean it was almost like relief. They exchanged their vows in front of a congregation that was not large, but was warm. Mrs. Aldridge and her husband, Timothy from the savings and loan, who looked startled to be moved by anything but clearly was, the Mexican families from the South Settlement who brought dried flowers and small handmade gifts, and Mrs. Proctor from the Stagecoach Inn, who had made the 30-mile drive, because she said she had suspected something when they stopped at her inn in September, and she was glad to be proven right. Harold Birch was not there, which was appropriate. After the ceremony they had a modest supper at the church hall, where someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a second one, and there was dancing that went until the cold drove the last people out, and Clara danced with Aaron in the warm and lamplight room while the fiddlers played something quick and joyful, and she felt the complete and specific happiness of a person who is exactly where they are supposed to be. On the ride home in the cold December dark, the stars blazing above the flat land with the particular ferocity of winter stars, Aaron pulled the wagon to a stop and reached behind the seat and produced the saddle, his saddle, with the ocean wave tooling, which he had apparently retrieved from its place in the front room without her noticing. I believe this is mine, he said. She looked at it. You never asked for it back. I knew I didn't need to, he said. I knew I was going to be around to collect it. She looked at the saddle in his hands in the starlight, and then at him, and felt the full weight and simplicity of what he had done in May. He had left this thing with her not just as collateral for a loan, but as a promise he had not yet made in words. The most important thing he owned, left in her keeping. A declaration he had not quite known he was making, perhaps, but that his instincts had understood even before his words did. Aaron, she said. Clara, he said. I love you, she said, and it was the first time she had said it in so many words, and the saying of it was like the knot releasing again, the same thing that had unknotted in September but deeper this time, the whole cable of it. He put the saddle down on the wagon bed and turned to her and cupped her face in his hands and kissed her in the winter cold with the stars overhead and the horses patient in their traces, and it was long and warm and real. And when they separated, Clara could see his breath misting in the cold air, and he was smiling, and she was smiling, and there was nothing better than that exact moment in all the world. I love you, he said. I think I have since the savings and loan. That was fast, she said. You came out carrying your tin box, he reminded her. The farm in the years that followed was a different place than it had been. Not because either of them transformed it beyond recognition, but because two pairs of hands and two minds, and the particular energy of two people who are deeply invested in the same future, can accomplish what one person working alone cannot, no matter how capable or determined that person is. The 8 head of breeding cattle from Peterson were added to the pastures in late October of 1882, before the wedding, and Aaron managed them with the skilled attention of a man who had spent 6 years doing exactly this work. By the spring of 1883, they had their first calves, 6 of them, healthy and loud, commanding Sunday the dairy cow's disapproval from across the fence. By the fall of that year, the beef herd had grown, and they had sold 2 yearlings at the Abilene market, for prices that made Clara's calculations look conservative. Clara continued the dairy operation and the Saturday market, but now with the additional revenue from the beef sales the farm moved from precarious to stable, and from stable, slowly, towards something that felt like abundance, not wealth exactly, not the kind of wealth that certain men in Dusty Creek wore as armor, but the deeper abundance of enough, reliably enough, with room for things to grow. They had help that second year. A young man named Ezra Thorne who came through Dusty Creek in the spring of 1883 looking for work, about 20 years old, with a nervous energy and a willingness to learn that Clara recognized as the disposition of someone who wanted to prove themselves. They hired him for the calving season, and he stayed through the summer and into fall, and his presence meant that Aaron could take the cattle to market himself while Clara managed the farm, which had previously been an impossibility. Ezra was good company, too. He was curious and funny in the way of young men who have not yet learned to be cynical, and he told stories about his family in Louisiana with the vivid affection of someone who had been loved well and knew it. Clara liked him very much, and Aaron mentored him with the patient practicality that she had come to understand was one of his deepest and most characteristic ways of caring about people. There was an afternoon in the summer of 1883, a hot and thundery August day when the air had a particular electric weight, when Clara came out of the house with 2 cups of cool water to find Aaron teaching Ezra to rope a fence post with the patient, repetitive method of a teacher who has unlimited time. She stood on the porch and watched them for a moment, Aaron demonstrating the throw, the easy flick of the wrist, the follow-through, then watching Ezra try it, making small corrections without criticism, then stepping back and letting him try again. The same patience he had with the cows, with her, with everything. The same quality of attention. She was 4 months along with their first child. She had not told Aaron yet, which was not from uncertainty, but from the pleasure of holding the knowledge for just a little longer. She had been watching him in the world, watching how he was with Ezra, with the animals, with the people in Dusty Creek who had initially not known what to make of him and had gradually come to trust him. And she had been measuring him against the task ahead, not because she doubted him, but because it was such a large and precious thing to know that the person beside you would be good at the most important work there was. She walked out to them across the yard with the water. "You two look like you're having a discussion with a fence post," she said. "The fence post is unresponsive," Aaron said, taking the water. "It keeps not moving," Ezra agreed mournfully, trying the rope again. "Ezra, let that come from your elbow, not your shoulder," Clara said, which was not something she had ever roped anything in her life, but which sounded plausible and which Ezra tried, and which actually improved his throw enough that the loop went cleanly over the post on the next attempt, to his evident amazement. "How did you know that?" Aaron said. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I just saw it." Aaron looked at her with an expression she recognized, the one that said he was seeing something in her he had not quite anticipated, one of those moments that kept occurring even after months of knowing each other well. That evening after supper, sitting on the porch in the August dusk, she told him. She watched his face. She had seen him be patient, competent, funny, sad, angry once briefly, when a fence contractor from town tried to overcharge them in a way that assumed they would not notice, and tender. She had not seen him undone before. But when she told him, something happened in his face that she had no other word for. He was undone, briefly and completely, in the best possible way. His eyes went bright and he put his face into his hands for a moment and then looked up, and she could see that he was trying to say something and not finding the words. "Aaron," she said gently. "I know," he said thickly. "I know, He stopped and shook his head and reached for her hand and held it very tightly, and they sat there in the August dark and the sounds of the summer night while he put himself back together around this new and enormous thing. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm so much better than all right," he said, in a voice that was not entirely steady. "I don't have a word for it." Their son was born in January of 1884, in the same room where Aaron had stored his saddlebags in that first uncertain spring. Clara's friend and neighbor, Maria Reyes from the South Settlement, attended the birth along with the doctor who rode out from Dusty Creek, and it was a long and serious night, but a good one. And when the morning came, there was a boy in the world who had Clara's dark hair and Aaron's gray eyes and an already apparent stubbornness that appeared to have come from both of them equally. They named him Thomas, for Clara's father. Aaron held him in the first morning light with the expression of a man who has been asked to hold something so valuable that ordinary caution is inadequate, and a new calibration of careful is required. He sat in the wooden chair beside the bed, and Clara watched him look at Thomas and thought she would remember this image for the rest of her life. This particular man, this particular morning, this particular light. "Hello," Aaron said to the baby, quietly and seriously, as though addressing someone whose dignity was important to acknowledge. "I am your father. I intend to do a very good job at that." Clara laughed softly from the bed, and Thomas opened his eyes in the manner of newborns who have not quite decided whether the external world is worth engaging with, and Aaron looked up at her with an expression so full of feeling that she had to press her hand to her mouth. The years settled around them like good weather. Thomas grew and was, from early on, a serious and observant child who watched everything with intense attention, and then tried to do it himself, which meant he was on a horse before he could reliably walk on flat ground and was helping with the cows before he was 3. Helping in the way of small children that creates approximately twice the work, but is too endearing to discourage. They hired 2 more hands as the cattle herd expanded, good men both, one of them the brother of Maria Reyes' husband from the South Settlement, a young man named Lewis who had a gift for horses that even Aaron acknowledged freely and without competitive feeling. The farm had become something closer to a small ranch by 1886, not large by the standards of the great cattle operations to the north and west, but productive and well-run, and theirs, entirely theirs, with no debt to Harold Birch or anyone else. Harold Birch, as it turned out, had a complicated few years. In 1884, it emerged that his management of the savings and loan had involved some creative accounting that his silent investors, led by a sharp attorney from San Antonio who had been suspicious for some time, finally caught up with. The resulting legal matter was not something Clara followed closely, because she had enough to manage, but the outcome was that Birch sold his share of the institution and moved to somewhere in the territories, and a new manager named Mr. Ellis took over the savings and loan and ran it with a straightforward competence that made it a genuinely useful institution for the people of Dusty Creek for the first time in its existence. Clara heard this news from Mrs. Aldridge at the Saturday market and felt a satisfaction that she recognized was not entirely gracious but was entirely honest. "Do you feel vindicated?" Aaron asked that evening. "Thoroughly," she said. "Is that a character flaw?" "Probably," he said, "but an understandable one." "He would have taken the farm," she said. "He would have," Aaron agreed. "And he didn't, that matters." She looked at him. "You matter," she said. "That's what I'm really saying." He looked back at her with that Stillwater gaze, deep and quiet and full. "I know," he said. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been that May morning in 1882, walking into the savings and loan with her tin box and her stubbornness and her desperate arithmetic. She thought about how alone that woman had been, not just in the practical sense of no help with the farm, but in the deeper sense of no one in the world who was looking at her particular problem and thinking about how to solve it, who saw her as a person worth the trouble of their care. Aaron had seen that. He had seen it in 15 minutes on a bench in a waiting room, which was extraordinary when she thought about it. He had left her his saddle. The most important thing he owned, the thing that defined a working cowboy's capability and freedom, left with a stranger as collateral on a loan, and then never asked for, because he had understood before she did what it would mean. The saddle lived in the front room on a proper saddle stand that Aaron had built in the fall of 1883, a neat piece of joinery that held the saddle at a good height for maintenance and access. He used it every day, of course. Belle was getting older but still sound, and Aaron used a saddle on her the way a craftsman uses his best tool, with respect and regular care. But in the evenings, when it was on its stand in the lamplight and Thomas was asleep and the farm was quiet, she would sometimes look at it and think about ocean waves. She had asked him once if he wanted to see the ocean. This was in the summer of 1885, when Thomas was a year and a half old and the ranch was doing well enough that the idea of a journey for its own sake had entered the range of conceivable. "Someday," he said, "I'd like to take Thomas. He's too young now," she said. "When he's older," Aaron said, "when he can understand it." What would you want him to understand? Aaron thought about this. That the world is bigger than what you can see from one place. That there are things worth going toward. He paused. And that the waves keep coming in whether you're there to see them or not, so you might as well go and see them. She loved him so much in that moment that it felt like something physical, a warmth in her chest that spread outward. "We'll go," she said, "when he's old enough." In the spring of 1887, Clara knew she was expecting again. This time she told Aaron in the evening, sitting on the porch, and his face went through the same undoing as before, the bright eyes, the hands over his face, the reaching for hers, but it also held something more settled, the particular quality of a man who has known great happiness before and recognizes it returning, and is deeply, quietly grateful. "Thomas is going to be delighted," Clara said, "or appalled. He has strong feelings about sharing things." "He'll be delighted," Aaron said with confidence. "Once he understands it's permanent." Thomas, at 3, was initially appalled by the abstract concept, and then progressively more interested as Clara's pregnancy advanced, and she let him feel the baby move, which he found simultaneously alarming and compelling, a reaction Aaron said he entirely related to. Their second child was born in November of 1887, in a birth that was quicker and less anxious than the first. A girl this time, small and imperious from the first moment, who announced her arrival with a volume that suggested she had things to say and was not interested in waiting. They named her Rose after Aaron's mother, which was a decision that had been made without much discussion, simply arrived at between them as right. Thomas, told that evening that his sister was named Rose, considered this seriously and then said, "Can she come outside?" "Not for a while," Aaron said. "When?" "A few months." Thomas looked at his sister with the calculating patience of a 3-year-old who has decided to take a long view. "I'll wait," he said. Clara, in the bed, exhausted and full-hearted, looked at her husband and her son and her daughter, and thought she might break open with the fullness of it. She thought about 60 acres and 3 dairy cows and a tin with $43 in it. She thought about a bench in a savings and loan and a man turning his hat. She thought about an ocean wave tooled into leather. "Aaron," she said. He was there beside her immediately, as he always was. "I'm here." "I know," she said. "That's what I'm saying. I know." He took her hand in both of his, and she closed her eyes and let the exhaustion and the happiness move through her without fighting either of them. The ranch continued to grow in the following years, but what Clara remembered most was not the growth itself, but the texture of the life inside it. The way Thomas grew up between his parents' different kinds of intelligence. his father's patience and his mother's directness, and became someone who had both. The way Rose was, from early childhood, fiercely herself in a way that both amused and occasionally alarmed her parents, with a clear eye for what was fair and an utter unwillingness to pretend that unfair things were acceptable. There was an afternoon when Rose was 7, and Thomas was nearly 11 that Clara would return to many times in memory. It was a late summer day, the kind that arrives in September and feels like summer's final generous offer before it begins its retreat. They had all ridden out together, Aaron on Belle, Clara on her mare, Thomas on his own horse which he had been managing independently for 2 years with the competence of a boy who had been on horseback since before he could walk, and Rose on a steady small pony named Jasper II, named by Thomas after Clara's old mule in a gesture of continuity that Clara had found genuinely touching. They rode to the creek bank where the cottonwoods were beginning to show the first edge of yellow, and they stopped there in the afternoon light, and the children waded in the creek while Aaron and Clara sat on the bank. "When do you think we should take them to the ocean?" Aaron said. "When Thomas can help manage the ranch while we're gone," Clara said. "Another couple of years, maybe. He could probably manage it now," Aaron said, "with Louis and the others. He's 10. He's a very responsible 10. She looked at her children in the creek, Thomas showing Rose how to build a small dam with stones with the patient instructional manner he had inherited directly from his father, Rose examining each stone with critical intensity before accepting or rejecting it for the structure, and thought, yes, he was a very responsible 10. "All right," she said. "Maybe next spring." Aaron put his arm around her on the bank in the September afternoon light, and she leaned into him, and they watched their children in the creek and the cottonwoods beginning their slow turning, and the sky very blue and clean above everything. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "When I rode into Dusty Creek that morning in May of '82, he said, "I was the most unmoored I had ever been in my adult life. 3 months without pay, the whole operation I had built my work around just gone. I was 45 miles from the nearest person I knew, and I had $112 in a bank in Abilene and no plan." He was quiet for a moment. "I sat on that bench in Birch's office and felt about as low as I could feel without actually going under," she listened. "And then you came in," he said, "and sat down across from me and held your tin box in your lap and looked like you had just come from a battle and weren't done fighting yet. And I thought," he stopped. "I thought, there is someone who understands something I understand, about not going under, about staying in the fight even when the numbers don't add up." "You thought all that in 15 minutes, she said. "I thought the beginning of it," he said. "The rest I've spent the last 7 years thinking." She turned to look at him. 7 years. She counted them backward, the wedding in the cold December church, the long summer of learning each other, the morning with the saddle at the hitching post, the bench in the savings and loan. "Aaron," she said, "did you know when you offered me that loan that it was going to go this way?" He considered this with the seriousness he gave everything. "Not in any clear way," he said, "but I knew I wanted a reason to stay in one place, and I knew something about you made me want the place to be wherever you were." He paused, "and I knew the saddle would get me back there." She laughed, because it was such an entirely Aaron thing to say, practical and romantic at the same time, the two qualities so integrated in him that they were inseparable. She kissed him on the bank of the creek in the September light while their children argued cheerfully about stone placement, and it tasted like coffee and permanence, and everything she had ever wanted from a life. In the spring of 1890, true to their plan, the Sawyer family made the journey to the Gulf of Mexico. It was an adventure of several weeks, by wagon to San Antonio, then by the newly extended railroad line to the coast at Galveston, a city that stood on a barrier island and bore the full reality of the ocean on its doorstep every day. Thomas was 15 and handled the journey with the self-contained competence of a young man who was very much his father's son. Rose was 12 and handled it with the uncontainable enthusiasm of a person encountering new things at precisely the rate that felt most satisfying. which was rapidly and without reservation. They stood on the beach at Galveston on a May morning, and the Gulf of Mexico was there, vast and green-blue and moving, the waves coming in with the measured regularity of something that has been doing this for longer than anyone can comprehend. The sound of it was unlike anything Clara had ever heard, a continuous layered sound like breathing, like time made audible. Rose ran into the shallows immediately and announced that it was cold and perfect. Thomas stood at the edge and looked at the horizon with an expression Clara recognized as the look his father wore when he was processing something large. Aaron stood beside her on the wet sand, his boots off because he was that kind of man on this day, and he looked at the ocean his mother had talked about all her life and never seen again, and Clara did not say anything because she understood that some moments require silence. After a while he said very quietly she would have loved this. "I know," Clara said. He took her hand. The waves came in. Rose turned around from the shallows and called, "Papa, come in, the water is extraordinary." Aaron looked at Clara with an expression that was grief and joy in the same moment, which is the most specifically human expression there is, the two things that cannot exist without each other. "Coming?" he called back to Rose, and looked at Clara once more, and she nodded, and he went. She stood on the beach and watched her husband walk into the Gulf of Mexico with his daughter, both of them laughing as a wave came in larger than expected and soaked them to the waist. And Thomas came to stand beside her with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone determined not to be moved by something moving, which lasted approximately 40 seconds before he took his boots off too. She stood alone on the beach for a moment, the salt wind in her face, and thought about the ocean on the saddle. The waves her mother-in-law had grown up hearing, now present, now real, under the feet of the family that saddle had helped make possible. She took her own boots off and walked into the water. It was cold and extraordinary. They stayed in Galveston for 4 days, which were among the most vivid of Clara's life, not because anything happened that was beyond the ordinary joys of a family exploring a new place, but because of the quality of happiness. It was the happiness of completion, she thought. The particular sense of a story that has reached its natural resting place, without being forced there. On the last evening they walked along the beach at sunset, all 4 of them, the light going brilliant over the water in the way of Gulf sunsets, which are different from land sunsets and more dramatic in the way of things that have more sky to work with. "I don't want to go back," Rose announced. "We have cattle," Thomas said with the pragmatism of a rancher's firstborn. "I know we have cattle," Rose said. "I am simply stating a feeling." "Stating a feeling is allowed," Aaron said. "The cattle are still going to need looking after when we get back," Thomas said. "Thomas," Clara said, "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying and you're right, but your sister is allowed to not want to leave the ocean for one evening." Thomas considered this. "Fair," he said, with the tone of someone making a concession that costs them something but that they recognize as correct. Rose looked at her brother. "Thank you," she said. "The cattle will wait one evening," Thomas said. Rose smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind she reserved for moments when people surprised her by being better than expected. They walked back along the beach in the last of the light, Rose collecting shells and putting them in her coat pocket, Thomas watching the horizon with the private thoughts of a 15-year-old who was already planning what kind of man he intended to be, Aaron and Clara walking close together, his arm around her shoulders against the evening breeze. "Thank you," Aaron said quietly. "For what?" "For everything," he said, which sounded large and vague but was not. She knew what it meant. For the farm and the 60 acres and the bench in the savings and loan and the 7 years and the 2 children and the place where he had been allowed to belong. "Thank you," she said. "For the loan." "You paid it back," he said. "I did," she agreed, "with interest. You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, "but it was the right thing." He looked at her. "That is the most Clara Kingsley sentence you have ever said." She laughed and leaned into him, and they walked on down the beach behind their children while the Gulf went purple and gold and the waves kept coming in, steady and unhurried, the way they had been coming for as long as the land had been there to meet them. They came home to Cottonwood Creek in late May. to the smell of the ranch in spring, and the sound of the cattle and Sunday's aged and permanent disapproval. Sunday being now an extremely elderly dairy cow who had outlasted reasonable expectations and seemed to be persisting out of sheer opinion. Lewis had managed everything impeccably in their absence, and Thomas went immediately to check on the spring calves with the focused relief of someone who has been away from important work longer than he was entirely comfortable with. Clara walked through the house when they arrived back, touching things: the kitchen table, the back of the chair by the window, the smooth, worn wood of the door frame, the oil lamp on the shelf, the bookshelf where the Dickens now lived alongside several other volumes they had accumulated over the years, the saddle on its stand in the front room, the ocean waves in the tooled leather catching the afternoon light in the same way they always had. She stood there for a moment looking at the saddle. Aaron came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she could feel his presence as warmth even before she leaned back against him. "Do you know what I thought that first morning?" she said. "When you carried it over to the hitching post?" "No," he said. "I thought it was the strangest and most honest thing anyone had ever done," she said. "Leaving the most valuable thing you owned with someone you had just met, as a promise you hadn't made yet in words." He was quiet. "I understood what it meant before I understood that I understood it," she said. "Does that make sense?" "Yes," he said, in the low, unhurried voice she had loved for 8 years. "That is exactly how it was for me, too." She turned to look at him in the afternoon light, this man who had ridden into her life on a Tuesday in May with nothing but principle and patience, and a saddle his mother had commissioned with ocean waves, and she thought, as she had thought before and would think again many times in the years ahead, what a thing it is to be truly known by someone, what a complete and specific grace. "I love you," she said, and it was as simple and as full as it had ever been, and it would always be. "I love you, Clara," he said, and the afternoon light came through the windows and the ocean waves on the saddle caught it and held it, and the ranch was quiet around them, and their children were somewhere on it, belonging to it and to them, and everything was exactly what it was supposed to be, not perfect in the way of things that have never known difficulty, but whole in the way of things that have been broken and broken again, until the repaired parts are stronger than the original. The years that came after were full years, generous years. Thomas grew into exactly the man he had been clearly becoming since childhood: steady, practical, fair-minded, with a patience for teaching that came directly from Aaron, and a directness in conversation that came directly from Clara. He took on more and more of the ranch management as he moved through his late teens and into his 20s, not out of any forcing from his parents, but because he was drawn to it, because the land was his and he knew it. Rose became a teacher. This was perhaps unexpected and perhaps not, given the ferocity of her opinions about fairness and the clarity with which she communicated them, and given Clara's own brief teaching during those first desperate months. Rose taught at the schoolhouse in Dusty Creek from the time she was 18, first as an assistant to the teacher there, and then, when that teacher retired to live with her daughter in Santa Fe, as the teacher herself. She taught the children of the Anglo settlers, and the children of the Mexican families from the South Settlement, and the children of the black families who had come up from the Reconstruction era South looking for land, and found some around Dusty Creek in the years following the war. And she taught all of them with the same expectations and the same respect, which was not the universal practice in the Texas of the 1890s, and which sometimes made her path difficult, and which she navigated with the particular combination of stubbornness and warmth that was specifically hers. Clara watched her daughter do this and felt a complicated pride that had something of recognition in it, the same stubbornness that had carried her into Harold Birch's office with a tin box and a spine made of something harder than iron. She told Rose once about that morning, about the tin box and the bench and the loan and the saddle. "He left his saddle with you as collateral," Rose said. "He did." Rose looked at the saddle on its stand. She had grown up looking at it and knowing it was important but not knowing the whole story. And you gave him the loan receipt as collateral for the saddle's return." "I didn't," Clara said. "I just kept it safe." "Because you knew he'd come back for it." "Because I knew," Clara said and paused, "that a man who leaves the most important thing he owns in someone else's keeping is a man who intends to return to both." Rose was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is a very good story, Mama." "It is a true story," Clara said. "Which is better?" In 1895, when Thomas was 11, which was wrong. Thomas was 11 in 1895 because he had been born in 1884, making him 11 in 1895. When Thomas was 21, he brought a young woman to Sunday dinner at the ranch. Her name was Adela Reyes, the daughter of Maria Reyes, who had attended Thomas's birth all those years ago, and she had grown up alongside Thomas in the way of children on neighboring properties who are aware of each other without quite being friends until something changes. What had changed was that Thomas had helped Adela's father repair a collapsed section of their barn roof after a spring storm, which was the kind of act that in Cottonwood Creek in 1895 carried the weight of serious intention, and which Aaron had recognized for what it was, and said nothing about until Thomas brought Adela to dinner. Clara watched Thomas across the Sunday table with Adela beside him, watched how he passed her things before she asked, and listened to her speak with the specific quality of attention that meant her words were the most important sounds in the room, and she felt Aaron's hand find hers under the table without either of them saying anything. "He looks like you," Clara said to Aaron quietly later. "He looks like you," Aaron said. "He has your patience. He has your eyes." "Aaron." "Clara." She turned to him and he was smiling, and she could see all of him in that smile. The man on the bench in the savings and loan, the man in the flooded pasture arguing with a dairy cow, the man on the creek bank at sunset, the man with his face in his hands at the kitchen table being undone by the news of Thomas, the man in the Gulf of Mexico with his arms out and his daughter laughing beside him. All of it. All of him, present in this moment, all of it building to here. "We did all right," she said. "We did more than all right," he said. Outside, through the open window, they could hear Thomas showing Adela the view from the porch. The 60 acres that had been Clara's father's and were now theirs. The pastures where the cattle moved in the late afternoon. The cottonwood trees along the creek bank beginning to show their spring green. The flat land going out in every direction under the enormous sky. "This is the Llano Estacado," Thomas was saying, with the particular pride of someone naming a thing they love. "It goes on like this for 100 miles in every direction. There's nothing else like it in the world." "It's so flat," Adela said, and her voice had the quality of someone working out how to feel about something large and unfamiliar. "It is," Thomas agreed. "But wait until the light changes." Clara and Aaron stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to their son explain to a young woman why the flat land was worth loving, and it was, she thought, one of the best things she had ever heard. The light changed, as it does on the Llano Estacado in the late afternoon, turning from the flat bright white of noon to the long warm gold of evening, and Adela made a quiet sound of recognition, the sound of someone seeing what had been described to them, and finding that the description was inadequate for the beauty. "There it is," Thomas said. "There it is," Adela agreed. And Clara leaned against her husband in the doorway of the home they had made together out of 60 acres, and a loan and a saddle that smelled of leather and ocean wind. And she closed her eyes and listened to the ranch in the evening, the distant sound of cattle, the creak of the windmill, the cottonwoods along the creek moving in the breeze, and felt the complete and irreducible satisfaction of a life that had arrived at its meaning not through luck or ease, but through the particular alchemy of two people who had chosen, in 100 small ways and a few large ones, to move toward each other and to stay. Aaron pressed his lips to her temple, the way he had done 1,000 times, and she felt it as she had felt it the first time, as something exact and particular, the specific warmth of a specific person who was hers and whom she was, who had left his saddle with her and never asked for it back because he had already known, before either of them could have said so in words, that he was leaving something more important than leather and tooling and an ocean that was still waiting for them. He was leaving himself. In her keeping, and she had kept him well. And the ranch was gold in the evening light, and the creek ran along its bank as it had always run, and the ocean waves on the saddle in the front room held the light as they always had, and it was enough, and it was everything, and it was theirs.